go. All right, good morning. It's Bernard Nomberg with another episode of NOMBERG Law Live. Hope everybody's doing well this morning. Good morning, Tamara. How are you doing?
Good, Bernard. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well, thank you. And thank you for getting up and doing this discussion with me so early. I know you're out in San Clemente, which is a couple hours earlier than where I am in Alabama, but thank you and good morning to you.
Glad to be here.
Guys, this morning we're going to be talking with Tamara McCormic. We're going to be talking about landlord and tenant issues, which every state is a little bit different, but what we're going to do is talk a little bit about Alabama law. We're going to talk about California law, which Tamara is well versed in. And we're going to just talk about things that may be important to tenants and some that may be important to the landlords or the owners. And I think it's vitally important because so many people, particularly young people, people who are mobile, who don't want to be tied down to a home and a mortgage and those things, it seems like that they're on the rise, the percentage of people who are renting. And so we're going to talk about those things for a few minutes. And Tamara, I know that you have a wide variety of interests growing up in California with the surf and just doing all the California things. But from a professional standpoint, if you would, just share a little bit about your background.
Well, from a professional standpoint, I went to law school and graduated about 20 years ago from law school, but took a turn and entered the real estate market with my husband. And as a result of getting my law degree, I actually took the California Real Estate Broker's exam and obtained my broker's license for the state of California and opened up my own real estate practice. This was in the early 2000s, and we did a lot of real estate investment projects ourselves. I worked with a lot of investors buying multi-unit properties as well as commercial properties. And that's kind of how I started my real estate career. And then transitioned about 2009, 2010 more into the legal arena. And for the last 2 years, I specifically have been working on a DNA innocence project here in the county of Orange. So I've been looking at, go ahead.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go. From a real estate standpoint, I know that you have many years of investing and being involved in writing contracts and just dealing with all sides of landlord and tenant issues. And you and I have talked for a few minutes prior to today that there's such a big variety or a big contrast, if you will, between California law and what I'm going to call pretty archaic Alabama laws when it comes to these issues. And if you would, just tell me what your thoughts on that. And we'll open it up wide and then we can niche it down a little bit as we go along.
Well, actually, I was surprised at the fact that Alabama has only really established tenant rights since 2007. And before then, Alabama was focused, or the landlord-tenant issues were focused mainly on common law property rights. And so, again, 2007 seems like not that long ago where you actually codified some tenant rights for the residents of your state. They are in line with somewhat the rest of the country. However, they still protect the landlords as far as weighting between the landlord and the tenant. I still think they sway more in favor of the landlord at this time, but in comparison to other states like California. The one thing, though, that is important for residents of Alabama is you guys have about almost 600,000 people in the state that are currently renting, and those numbers are only rising. So to be aware of your tenant rights, and whether you're renting an apartment, a room, a home, it's important for most people even around the nation, but especially in Alabama as the numbers are significantly rising.
And Tamara, we have a population in our state of less than 5 million total. That seems like a pretty significant number. If you take away the children,
Yeah.
if you take away home ownership, 600,000, that seems like a pretty good percentage.
It's a big chunk.
Let's talk a little bit
And that
about.
number's only.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying that number's only increasing. as the millennial population is increasing. They are tending to rent more than they are buying at this point.
You know, I did some research earlier this week for some videos and some other things that I'm doing here at our firm. And as you know, we do work comp and Social Security and personal injury. But what I've been looking about is the trends that are going on in what's been called in the last several years the gig economy, where people who are the younger generation, or maybe people who are older just looking for a side job, the percentage of the people who are in the workforce is rising dramatically. Somewhere between 50 and 60 million people in the United States have what they call gig jobs, side jobs, driving for Uber. Maybe you go to the grocery store and purchase groceries through a company like Shipt, freelance copywriters, etc. And as part of the research that I read, is part of that mindset is that people don't want to be tied down with the traditional mortgages and the 15 to 30 year obligations of home ownership. And so I guess what I'm saying is it just seems like, as you said a second ago, the trend is for more and more renting as preferred for living environment, particularly with the younger generations. And I didn't know if you had that experience, what you deal with in California.
Yeah, you do. You have, I mean, the gig economy in California, especially Northern California, is huge. I mean, it's predominantly based on that independent contractor type environment. Although our laws here are changing to protect them not more as an individual employee, but beyond that issue, you have younger people that are wanting to rent more, that don't want to be tied down. And what's interesting here is we're even moving even further to the left, where you have people who are living mobile. They are buying motorhomes. They are taking Sprinter vans and converting them, and they are working. And so they can, I mean, literally, there's an entire population of young people who go to the beach every day. They have their Sprinter van. They have an entire unit set up in there, and they can work remotely. They've got their internet. They have their solar power. And they live like that. And it's almost a nomadic life, but it's this remote life that they're living. And so we're even moving away from even renting units here to living this more nomadic life where they're living in mobile homes or mobile units, so to speak.
Well, I don't know how much we're going to actually see that here in Alabama. We're not nearly as progressive of a state. I do want to say good morning to Mom, Cece, Mitch, and Melanie, who are currently watching with us. Guys, I've got Tamara McCormic, and we're talking about landlord-tenant issues, such an important topics for people who are younger generation, who many are buying homes, but I think the percentage of those who want apartments for their first years coming out of college, or they're in their mid-20s, maybe even early 30s, seem to be renting more and more. Tamara, let's shift a little bit and let's talk about the traditional landlord-tenant dynamic. Typically, from what I know, my limited experience is there's always going to be a contract, a lease of some sort, that should spell out terms of the contract. But we all know that paperwork can be pretty definitive, but things sometimes get sideways. Let's talk about the landlord side first. How do landlords, and I know you've looked a little bit about the Alabama law and you know the California laws, how do landlords protect themselves? How do they do what's right in this situation? What should they be doing?
I think from a landlord perspective, making sure that you fully vet your tenant when you are renting to them, making sure you do I actually do full background checks on tenants that I rent to. So that can include checking their rental history, checking their work history, and then I also do a criminal background check as well. And there's services that you can utilize in order to do this, but that ensures that you don't place anybody in one of your rental units that potentially has criminal background, possibly on the sex registration list, maybe has paid rent but doesn't have good work history. All those things will solidify that they generally will be a good tenant. And then there's always that other element to make sure that when you put a tenant in a property that you own, making sure that that property is that quote habitable, meaning just essentially that the property is working. Everything works in the property. It has running water, the electricity works, that the area is safe, the common areas. As a landlord, you're responsible to maintain the common areas. And so making sure all those areas are safe, they're well lit. Doing that and making sure that you have a property that is, I wouldn't rent anything that you wouldn't live in. So I think that's a good rule to follow for any landlord. You know, if you would live there and it's safe and everything's working properly, your tenants are going to be happy. And your tenants are also going to treat the property as their own home more so than if you don't take care of the property.
What about from a standpoint where you're trying to market your property? With everything being on social media and everything, your world is right here. Do landlords, are there certain services or ways that they can get the word out to show their properties?
Oh, sure. I mean, you still work with a traditional realtor or broker, and they can list it for you on the MLS, and other agents can show the property to a potential tenant, clients that they have. So that's always probably the broadest way to market the property in the most traditional way. And then if you're not using the services of a realtor, then you can always do it yourself. Now with services like Zillow and Redfin, you can actually list your own property on these sites yourself.
So
And
there's a lot of deep do-it-yourself opportunities as well. You don't have to go through an agent.
Exactly. More and more people are moving to those type of platforms. Before Zillow, I mean, if you were doing it yourself, landlords would post it on Craigslist, and there's a whole rental section. So, but we are having more of these independent sites where you can post your properties for rent.
Well, let's shift away from the landlord, and I really want to focus maybe the balance of our talk about tenants' rights. How do tenants protect themselves, what they need to do from I'll call it a best practices standpoint and common sense standpoint to do the right thing when they're looking for properties and entering into leases. And let's say it's their very first rental and their very first lease. They don't have mom and dad there just to go over everything with them who may have done this before. What are some suggestions, some tips for people who are just getting into renting for the first time?
Well, I think there's so much information now on the internet. A simple Google search of, what are my tenant rights? It's important to do that ahead of time. And read the lease before you sign anything. I mean, I've tried to teach my kids this from the time they were. It doesn't matter what you sign, read it. And for the most part, I think most leases today, they're fairly straightforward. And some of the legalese you may not understand, Google it and you'll figure it out. But definitely read all the fine print, know what you're signing, know what kind of lease you're entering into. Are you entering into a month-to-month contract where you're just responsible to pay month on a monthly basis? Or are you entering a lease that's for a year? Because that'll determine whether you can move or not and the flexibility with your lease. So know the duration of your contract, know exactly how much you're paying, what your late fees are going to be. If you pay via check, although most younger people don't pay via check anymore, they Venmo everything. But know exactly.
Most of the questions, what's a check?
A lot of them don't do it. I mean, now everything can be set up through ACH, or you can Venmo your landlord your rent. But know what happens if you're going to be late. Know what all these charges are, and they should be spelled out specifically in your lease.
One of the things that I bet that most young renters or inexperienced renters don't realize is that they could be separately or severally responsible for everybody's rent if they have roommates at the time. So just because you move out doesn't mean, or just because they move out, it doesn't mean certain things. And I think you're exactly right that language in that document is so important to understand what you're getting into.
Yeah, roommate situations are always funny because you go in as best friends, and often you've never lived together, but you're great friends. And then somebody gets a boyfriend or a girlfriend and then they want to move out, and the next thing you know, you've been sharing rent with this individual, and now all of a sudden they just move. And like you said, that you're individually and severally liable. So which means essentially that, like you said, if they move out, you're on the hook for the entire rental amount and any damage that it may have been caused. So making sure that you know exactly who you're friends with, and that they know that you're both responsible for rent and for any damages. And if that happens, I mean, it does. That's life. That happens a lot. Try to make sure that you convey and you speak with your landlord, communicate with your landlord about what's transitioning, and then look for a new roommate as fast as you can. And sometimes they'll have a vetting process with the landlord to apply, but I've seen that happen time and time again.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's, as you mentioned when we started our conversation, it wasn't until a little over 10 years ago that Alabama codified the Alabama Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act. And I know that you had a chance to briefly look over some of these things, but when I read through my notes and the actual act, it still seems like even though landlords do have certain responsibilities, it still seems that they have the upper hand, if you will, and that tenants are still fighting for any rights that really I would take for granted, but naively. And I'd like your expertise, your comments on what you think about how a tenant in Alabama can, protect themselves even more fully. And I don't mean to be long-winded, but here's what I'm going with this is we have the Landlord and Tenant Act, but then you also have a lease that may or may not conflict with what the law said. And I'm sure that most people who are renting for the first time have no clue about what the act and those laws are. They just are concerned about the contract. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm trying to convey to you, but I'd like some thoughts about what you think about that.
Well, ultimately, the state law is going to control even over the lease. The act is going to control over the lease, and even in regards to the Alabama Act, federal law is going to control over the Alabama Act. So issues in regards to civil rights, federal discrimination, that's always going to control. So just to know, you cannot discriminate in housing specifically based on race, sexual orientation, religion, gender identification, all those elements you cannot discriminate as from a landlord perspective. Now, even if you have children, a landlord cannot discriminate from renting against you. However, there's certain areas where if you're 55 or older, they can create those areas that are age specific. That being said, as far as protecting yourself as a renter and a tenant, when you go into a lease, make sure that, and this is one of the biggest issues that tenants have, is when it comes to their security deposit and when they move. And one of the things you can do is when you move into a property, make sure you fully document everything that's wrong, that doesn't work. And literally you can go through, with your iPhone nowadays, you can go through and you can video everything. And that's a good practice to do. When you move into a property, video everything. If you see something that's not working, document it. What you can also do is I utilize this called a move-in, move-out sheet. And it's basically an itemization of every room in a house or an apartment, the interior, the exterior. And you just kind of go through and you mark off, this is working, this isn't working, this isn't working, this isn't working, or this has wear and tear, the paint's peeling here, the floor is chipped here, the tile's broken in there. Making sure you document all of that beforehand, signing it, and also have your landlord sign it as well, so that you're both on the same page, so that when you are ready to move, because we all move, when you are ready to move, you're not going to get charged for any damages that have occurred. And one of the biggest things that people tend to sue over is return security deposits. Mm-hmm. So in Alabama, which is different than California, Alabama is probably one of only 2 states that gives landlords 2 months to return an individual's tenant's security deposit. The landlord has 60 days to return a security deposit in the state of Alabama. In California here, it's 21 days. In some states like Alaska, it's only 14 days. So you guys have the landlord's got a lot of time to hold on to your security deposit before they have to return it. If they do make deductions, they need to itemize those deductions and let you know what they're subtracting out for. But making sure that you've documented everything will help you ensure that your full amount of security is refunded to you. And then also, if it's not, you can always go to small claims. And I believe in Alabama, you correct me if I'm wrong, you can sue up to $3,000. Is that correct?
I'm not sure what the current level is, but what I was going to add is a couple of times a year I volunteer at Volunteer Lawyers Birmingham. My brother and I go down there different times, and it's a free legal service where anybody who has issues with anything in the legal system can come down there and have their situations looked at. And it could be domestic relations. It could be a small car wreck. It could be really just about anything. But I will tell you, over half of the cases I've looked at in probably 10 years of going down there are landlord-tenant disputes. And it could be, just like you said, it could be the issue over the security deposit. It could be an issue over the home that they're renting is not habitable because there's a hole in the kitchen ceiling and roof and water drips in. So it really, for a few years, it was surprising. And now, unfortunately, we just see so much of it. We just expect those issues. And landlords just seem, I'm not saying that all, but the ones that we see, that just seem to take advantage of people who don't have many options from a living standpoint. And it really, it's upsetting, but there's only so much that you could do. Tamara, I do want to say, go ahead.
I was just going to say, unfortunately, in Alabama, you cannot do what's called repair and deduct, where you repair that hole in the wall and then deduct it from your rent. You have to notify your landlord, let them know that let them know in writing, give them 14 days to make the correction. If they don't, then you have the option to potentially move and get out of your lease. However, you cannot repair it and deduct and withhold it out of your rent. You have to keep paying your rent as long as that hole's in the ceiling. And then ultimately, if you do go to court, you can contest it and you can file a counterclaim, but you always have to pay your rent in the state of Alabama. You cannot ever not pay your rent.
Tamara, we've got some comments I want to share with you, and I want to say good morning to Mike and Dave. Audra, Cece says the lease should reflect the language of the act, and I would agree with that to help alleviate some of these arguments, some of these issues. Mike Jack says, awesome information, great live. Audra says, this is what the pre-move out inspection is for, identifying damages and allowing a tenant to cure those damages prior to move to ensure full return of their deposit. Does that typically happen, or do things, if someone is upset with their living conditions, I guess maybe the emotions get the best of them and they just move out and they don't really bother with those things?
It depends on the situation, but if you have that move-in sheet and you've fully gone through everything prior, you should be getting a full security refund. What you can do is, the state of Alabama doesn't codify this, but what you can always do is you can request that the landlord do a pre-move out inspection with you. Let's say you have to move out on the 30th. Ask them to come through on the 27th with you and just walk the property with you and make sure that you've done everything that you need to do, that you've cleaned it properly, that you've fixed everything. And so if there's anything that you might potentially have an issue over, the landlord could say, hey, you know what, there's that blind over there that's broken, or something of that nature, and let you know ahead of time so that you can correct it and fix it prior to moving out. So that's something that you can always ask for. It's not solidified in Alabama for you as a right as a tenant yet. Maybe it will be, but and then as far as the leases are concerned, every state has an association of realtors. We have the California Association of Realtors, you have the Alabama Association of Realtors, and then we also have the National Association of Realtors. Most of these entities have their own leases, and you have an entire team of real estate attorneys that have drafted these leases. If at all, the best practice would be to utilize one of these leases that the Alabama Association of Realtors has created, rather than something that they got off the internet.
Right.
Because they've taken the time to make sure that the lease reflects what the Alabama code says.
I want to welcome Jason, who's watching with us, and we've got another question for you, Tamara. Can I break a lease if I find mold?
Oh, toxic mold. That's probably one of the second biggest issue, the other security deposits that people are litigating over. And again, here's the thing. You have to do what's best. I'll say this. You always have to do what's best for you. If you feel like you are living in an environment that has black mold, that has toxic mold, and it's causing you to have symptoms, I would move. You can contact the landlord and let them know and see if they can correct it. But again, that's your health that you're dealing with, and that exposure over time can certainly be detrimental. But that being said too, sometimes mold is a simple fix. Sometimes a good quart of bleach and water, something that grows, you can clean it up. But if you have an ongoing water leak, whether it's a water leak in the slab or it's in the wall or it's in the ceiling, and the water's gone behind the walls and you have this mold growth, it's hard to remedy that unless you fully open up the walls and do a full mold remediation. So one thing would be to let your landlord know this is an issue. They may not even know it's an issue. And as a tenant, you do have a responsibility to let your landlords know, hey, there's a water issue or there's a mold issue. So that's kind of a dicey area, whether you can specifically move or not. But again, letting your landlord know there's an issue, allowing them the time to try to remediate and fix the problem, I would do that first and foremost. But if you have a landlord that is not trying to remedy and is kind of putting their head in the sand and ignoring the issue, then I would never take my family's health and subject them to the mold growth.
Yeah, it seems like that, unfortunately, those situations do come about, and that landlords either ignore it or they put the responsibility back on the tenant more often than not. Guys, if you're just joining us, or even if you watch us later on, I'm with Tamara McCormic from San Clemente, California. Tamara has just given us such awesome knowledge from not only a landlord standpoint, but from a tenant standpoint about things to consider from a best practices approach of landlord and tenant issues. Tamara, I appreciate your time today and your expertise. This has been some great information. How can folks get in touch with you? I know you don't practice in Alabama, but if people are in California or have those kind of questions, or if they just have questions in general, what's the best way to get in touch with you about these issues?
You can always send me a Facebook message. That's always one simple at Tamara McCormic, and I'm sure you can put it in the show notes, my full name, or you can send me an email at tkmccormic, mccormic@gmail.com, and I'm happy to help you with anything I can, or if I can't, hopefully I can direct you to somebody who can help you in the state of Alabama.
Well, Tamara, thank you so much for your time today. It was such a pleasure chatting with you and learning so much that I have need to know and everyone needs to be more informed about.
Oh, well, thanks so much, Bernard, for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, guys, this will conclude another episode of NOMBERG Law Live, as we do every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Central, 8 a.m. Pacific. And thank you again, Tamara, for getting up early, getting out on such an early time for you. We will come back to you again next Tuesday, and we hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you.